Hi everyone, welcome to Reason with Science. I'm your host Jitendra. Our guest is Mark Blumberg, a neuroscientist at University of Iowa, whose work has reshaped how we understand infant sleep, movement, and early neural development. His research reveals a picture of sleep that is anything but passive, one in which the brain is highly active, self organizing, and laying down the foundations for everything from sensation to coordination. In this episode, we'll explore how sleep unfolds in distinct stages, why infants spend so much time in REM sleep, and how those small jerky twitches turn out to be powerful developmental signals. We'll examine the role of sleep in learning and memory and what happens when sleep is disrupted in early life. We'll also look at the evolutionary forces that shape REM sleep and what infant sleep can teach us about the myth of the blank slate. This is Reason with Science. Let's begin. So, hi, Mark. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so let's just dive right in. We all sleep. We know kind of what it feels like, but scientifically, let's try and understand what is sleep.
Well, that's certainly one of the biggest questions that at least some of us are struggling to understand. I mean, the the definitions of sleep, of course, have changed over the years. You can have behaviorally based definitions. You can have electrophysiologically based differences like, EEG or respiration and things like that. So there are a lot of things that go into it. I call them, and others call them components. And there's always a question of whether we should be talking about sleep per se, like is sleep a thing unto itself, or is it just a series of components that happen to aggregate at certain times of the day or and night actually for us? So that's one big morass of problems, and the problems become really serious when you're dealing with trying to understand sleep across the lifespan, especially in early development. When sleep doesn't look exactly the way it does in adults, but because sleep started largely as a medical profession, there were diagnostic criteria for sleep, and when you apply it to babies, they don't fit, and so you end up saying like, well, maybe it's not real this or real that, and you start getting into these horribly semantic arguments that can divert attention for a long time. And then also when you go across species, whether different mammals, and then you move into lizards, flies, octopuses, and now you're dealing with animals that don't share, that are whose last, common ancestor with us was many millions of years ago. And so you're dealing with that level of diversity as well. So these are not trivial problems. They can be made trivial under some circumstances, but they're not trivial problems. We're still struggling with them.
So it's like sort of like dealing with all the different disciplines in under one big umbrella, right?
Yes. Yeah, there can be a lot of philosophy, and sometimes it gets just into language and categorization, and how do you think about complex phenomena? How do you define them in ways that are satisfying and that actually advance science as opposed to just become fodder for um, for arguments in the bar?
So, what's your preferred way of sort of looking at sleep? How do you sort of understand it from your work?
So I guess so the metaphor that some colleagues and I used in a paper recently was, how should we think about the relationship between the components of sleep and then what sleep is itself? So on the one hand, you could think about sleep as the sleep components as sort of like the pieces of a place setting, right? So you have the fork and your knife and the glass of, your glass to hold a beverage, et cetera. And you could say like, what are all these things? How are all these things related? Where they're all for the purposes of ingestion of food and water or what have you, right? So that's one way that there are a whole bunch of things that are gathered together in one place for one common functional purpose. That's one view. The other view is that it could be more like a Swiss Army knife, where every component is just gathered together in one place, but each part can be completely, you could have a magnifying glass and a fish scaler, a nail file and a knife. I mean, things that are not necessarily connected to each other in any functional way, but having them all in one place makes sense. And so I think that the answer is probably a combination of both. There are some things that are complementary in sleep, and then there are some things that are not. And the way I like to think about it is just to challenge, you and your audience to think about, people ask, why do we sleep? Well, why are we awake? And when you just flip that, like, so there's a huge asymmetry in how we think about sleep. We think about it as this thing that is just unto itself. It's completely different. Wake, we all understand what wake is, right? So yeah, try to explain why you're awake. Are you awake to talk? Are you awake to eat? Are you awake to walk? Are you awake to, have babies? Are you awake to, what are you awake for? And then you realize that the same problem that you would have trying to define why we're awake applies to why we're asleep. But because we're asleep when we're asleep, we don't have the same intuitive understanding of the complexities of it. And so we end up just lumping it all under one category and thinking that we understand it that way. And that's how I think about it. And I've obviously this is a very, very big problem, and
Yeah.
has lots of layers and nuances to it.
Yeah. I mean, before we go to, before we talk about the components of sleep, let's sort of talk about, in general, there are like notions, right? The one major notion is that our brain is less active, or sort of, we switch off our brain when we sleep, right? So
Mhm.
is it true? What's your sort of data, or what's the data in this about this notion?
So nothing could be further from the truth, actually. So we've known that for a long time. That was one of the first big um, sort of neurophysiological insights that people had. So let's just take the REM sleep, and let's take what's called the sleep paralysis, the muscle paralysis that happens during REM sleep. So if anybody, is if you hold up if you see a dog and it's sleeping, maybe its eyes are moving, its limbs are twitching, and you pick up that paw and you drop it, you'll notice that the paw just drops as if there was no control of it at all. And so this is the sleep paralysis that we talk about. And the early view was that, well, maybe it's just a withdrawal of activation, so it's just a passive reduction in the activation of the limb. But as was discovered in the 50s and later, 1950s that is now, um, the there's actually an active process of inhibiting the motor neurons in the spinal cord so that they cannot function. There are exceptions to that, which we can talk about later, but there's an active process. And so that's the difference between a passive definition of sleep and an active definition of sleep. And once you realize that there's an active component to sleep paralysis, well, then other things followed. Like there's a tremendous amount of brain activation during REM sleep. There's different waves that happen during non-REM sleep. And just generally activity is higher. And we have found in infant rats, and now also in premature human infants, that the brain is not only is it active during sleep, specifically during REM sleep, but it's more active in many parts of the brain than it is during wake.
So when it comes to like type of sleeps, REM is, I think it's like one of the common sleeps, and in the sense, like a lot of people, they know about it, but then there are also like different stages of sleep, right? And let's sort of delve into that. What are those different stages? And then we can kind of talk about how do they affect, and which one is connected
Yeah.
to those, the components of the sleep. Yeah.
So in mammals, there are two primary stages of sleep. One is rapid eye movement or REM sleep. The other one is non-rapid eye movement sleep, non-REM sleep. Um, and to get back to sort of like to harken back to what we were talking about earlier, each one of those stages has a lot of different names associated with it. So REM sleep has also been called paradoxical sleep, the paradox of being paralyzed but having a very active brain. So that's where that came from. Mostly used in Europe, but also somewhat in the United States. So REM sleep, it's also called active sleep, although active sleep was used to be used only for infancy, but some people think it should be used more generally. It's also been called desynchronized sleep. It's been called inappropriately dream sleep. Um, and so it's got a whole bunch of different names. Clue number one that there's a problem, when you have that many different names for the same thing. The other one, non-REM sleep, has also been called slow wave sleep. It's called delta sleep, which is another name for that slow wave. It's called synchronized sleep. It's been called deep sleep. So all of these names have certain, they're either focusing on individual components like rapid eye movements or slow wave sleep, or they're focusing on some understanding of what of what it is, sometimes misinterpreting what it is. And then in humans, in non-REM sleep, you have multiple substages, N1, N2, N3, um, which reflect different aspects of the underlying architecture of the state. But when you move into other animals, um, the staging, the substaging becomes more tricky. And and also when you move into lizards or flies, you don't have REM non-REM distinction, but there are sometimes there is some evidence for two different stages, and that leads to a whole debate about how those two stages that you see in these other animals relates to the REM non-REM distinction that we have in mammals. And that's a very much an open area for debate right now.
Yeah. And REM sleep is generally also considered like a sort of stage of dreaming, right? But your work
Yeah,
and the work of other people, they actually show that it's more than that, right?
way more than that.
Mhm.
I've gone out on a limb in my field to sort of say that I think we focus too much on dreams, but
Mhm.
so the REM sleep, uh, dreaming happens at all stages of sleep. I mean, so the notion that there's one that you're only dreaming during REM is not correct. There's good evidence that, but it's all based on self-report because all you can do is, the only way you can study a dream is to have somebody dream and have them tell you about it, right? So that's sort of an issue. But people report more bizarre dreams during REM sleep than they do during non-REM sleep. Okay, um, but there's so much more to REM sleep than dreams, and I don't even know if dreams should be even close to being a central component of our study of sleep. So there are just too many other things that are going on that are basic fundamental physiological processes in the brain and the body that deserve the bulk of our attention, more than the bulk of our attention, for understanding what sleep actually is.
Yeah. Maybe let's talk about the kind of tools that you would use to sort of study sleep before we go into the details, right? How sort of it brings the broader picture.
Well, when you're studying humans, you're somewhat limited. So you have imaging or EEG, measures of brain activity, but most of what's being studied and what's focused on is the cortical activity. So that's a very limited perspective on what's going on during sleep, where so much of sleep is happening in the brainstem and the spinal cord and things that's happening throughout the body. So focusing on the cortex is one of when you study humans, there tends to be a huge bias that the cerebral cortex is where you should be spending your time. um, and I don't think that's the case at all. So uh, and then you have, like I said, you can measure respiration and heart rate, and things like that. In animals, you can start diving more deeply into the brain, recording brain activity anywhere you want to, really. And so when you do that, you see that you start to discover, as people have, all the brainstem mechanisms that are responsible for the production of sleep. Um, so in early development, which is where I focus my attention, we've done a lot of recordings throughout the brain, from the cortex to the brainstem, and you start to see how all of it fits together when you start to look at it that way. Um, but yeah, so I mean, there are a whole host of different ways of studying sleep. But for me, coming out of a behaviorally oriented field, you can do a lot just by studying behavior. Just by looking what the animal does, their posture, their movements, their breathing. You can learn a lot just by looking at what's happening on the outside of the organism, and inferring what's going on inside.
Yeah. I think so I mean, because I had a conversation with Giorgio Gilestro, who's working at UCL, London, and his work sort of points out at the difficulties of having appropriate tools to study sleep, especially in animals and stuff, because he's like the whatever methods that you use. So, for example, one common practice would be to keep an animal awake for longer time. Means awake would be like to keep that animal active for quite a long time to actually understand the repercussions of the of not sleeping in a way. And this is where like you end up introducing a lot of stress component into the, like in the behavior, and probably what you may observe might not be just the just the effect of sleep absence state. It might be the effect of the stress induced by the several methods. So what's your comment on that?
Well, yeah. So I was at the University of Chicago getting my PhD when Alan Rechtschaffen first reported his, at the time, groundbreaking breaking method of what we call the disk over water method. So this was in 1983, and the paper had just been published in Science. And it was a method where he tried to do everything he could to control all aspects of the sleep deprivation procedure. And it was a very attention-getting procedure, and the results were quite shocking in many ways. It was the first time that anybody had demonstrated that you could actually kill an animal by depriving them of sleep for a very long period of time. And so this is the birth, in some ways, of the concerns about the stress aspects. Now, he went to great lengths to show that there were no normal stress reactivity problems for the animal, but there are reasons, people could, argue about that, because, it all comes down to how you define stress and the whole other problem. But what he showed was that, after several weeks of deprivation in rats, um, their metabolism would go through the roof. Their metabolism would be so high that these animals would be eating their body weight in food every day, but still losing weight. So um, it was a crazy thing, and he discovered a lot of interesting things through that process. But the question is, what did we actually learn about sleep from it? And I think, a reasonable case or a strong case could be made that we didn't really advance our understanding of the fundamentals of sleep through that. And Al Rechtschaffen was a very deep thinker, and he was a careful thinker. But I think, that method and the other methods that are like it were like you were saying, that there are limits to it because you're not really getting at the heart of what is happening during normal sleep when you disturb it in such a dramatic way, or even in a non-dramatic way sometimes. Now, we've used in pups, we can generate a tremendous amount of sleep pressure, that is the pressure to go to sleep, after just 30 minutes of sleep deprivation. So if it's actually quite hard to keep infants awake, infant rats awake for longer than 30 minutes. It takes a heroic effort. We don't even bother to do it. And what we do learn from that, though, is we learn about the development, the emergence across age of certain types of processes that may not exist at one age and all of a sudden do at another. And I think when you add that extra dimension of developmental change, now you're starting to get at something about what's happening in the animal and how is sleep changing across that period. But if you only rely on sleep deprivation methods, I think you're going to be limiting tremendously your ability to make inroads into understanding what sleep is.
And how do you sort of take care of this component in your experiments?
How do I
Yeah, sort of.
the stress, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, we've measured stress hormones, for example, and they don't really happen. And
Hmm.
I think that at those ages, so the stress systems change across age. But you know, um, I don't, we don't rely too heavily on it. We use it to ask very specific questions.
Hmm.
Uh, and so I think the nature of the questions we're asking help to alleviate some, like, we're not trying to get at what is sleep through this process. We're trying to understand, are certain parts of the brain communicating with each other in a reliable way, and sleep deprivation is one way to test the bounds of the coupling among different parts of the brain when they're communicating with one another. So the interest that we have in using sleep deprivation is a more narrow question than what it was originally devised to do by Al Rechtschaffen and others, which was to finally unfold the total understanding of sleep, which clearly it did not accomplish.
Yeah. I mean, I just wanted to sort of, um, show that, okay, the methods that you are using, how far they can go when it comes to sort of studying sleep, etc. But now let's go to the questions that you're studying. And one of the obvious question is, which I'm sure a lot of people might have noticed, that why do babies sleep a lot, right? And we see that they sleep quite a lot compared to the adult humans, if we talk about humans here. So
Right.
let's go there and let's talk about that.
Well, so the first thing that we have to say is that every animal that's been studied for which there is a reasonable definition of sleep, you can see that they sleep more when they're young. So that there's a developmental component of sleep that appears to be near universal, if not universal. In humans and rats and cats and dogs, and you run through it, there is just more sleep when we are young. We sleep the most at those early ages, and that is when we mostly get our REM sleep. So REM sleep is proportionally higher when we're young than when we're older. So just take an example of humans. When we're born, we're sleeping about 16 hours a day. 8 hours of that is REM sleep, and 8 hours is non-REM sleep. And by the time we're adults, the amount of REM sleep goes down to 2 hours a day. So it's a fourfold increase in early development of REM sleep. And this was first noticed in the 1960s by a scientist named Howard Rothberg. And he published a very, very influential paper on this in 1966 in Science, in which he showed that infancy, that he just showed across the lifespan. That was the first time this was ever put, but he showed that sleep is dominated by REM sleep when we're younger, and it just goes down across age and it even gets worse as we move into old age. So or good, I should say, it just gets lower as we get into older age. And so that led, in that paper, he proposed that the propensity to have REM sleep early in development is perhaps indicative of its having functional REM sleep having functional importance for the developing infant. And he basically proposed that it was related to certain aspects of brain development, and brain activity, which I think he mostly got right. And so I and others, in the intervening years, have tried to advance that idea in our own ways by showing how sleep is important for plasticity in the nervous system in early development, so basic processes of learning and development, how it's important for certain specific developmental processes. But it all going towards the idea that there is a fundamental developmental function for REM sleep early in development. There is still, harkening back to your opening question, and that's where a lot of these some interesting debates have arisen about, is it really REM sleep? Are these animals really sleeping, or is it something completely different, or is it some weird amalgam of different states? All that stuff. So it's not without its complexities, but I think the consensus of you now is that infancy is predominantly composed of non-REM sleep, and then of REM sleep, and then non-REM sleep starts to emerge and grow over development.
And that's a huge difference. I mean, it sounds like REM sleep in early development being like some sort of superpower, right? It's like which is probably required. I mean, I'm sure that we will talk more about that for the development of newborns, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, whether it's how to characterize it is still, I think, up for grabs. But the the fact is there, and even if you want to debate um, whether or not this is the same type of sleep in early development as it is later, and I think there are many reasons to argue that it is. Um, there are things that are happening that are so tightly connected with these states, um, such as the one thing that I study in my lab are these muscle twitches, limb twitches that occur during sleep. They're such happening at such high rates that forget about the debate over sleep. You cannot debate the fact that these movements are happening at very high rates early in development and have to be explained.
So yeah, let's talk about the twitching part. So what are I mean, twitching would be just like a movement of muscles in the when they are asleep, right?
Yeah.
And how do you sort of monitor them? How do you study them? And what are your results?
So that's a big
Yeah,
one. Okay,
yeah,
so so I mean, it is a weird thing for me to study, and I always have to sort of say, like, why are you studying twitches? Is like, why would you study? I mean, it just sounds silly and trivial, right? It just it's like it sounds like Well, in fact, that was the dominant view of twitching since, Aristotle, was that twitches are byproducts of a dreaming brain, that you're dreaming about moving, so you move and the movements are like blunted in some way. They're just, you know, just just steam rising off of an engine, and they're not uh, interesting or important because who would ever want to study steam rising out of an engine? It's of completely no functional importance for driving a car, for example. And but back in the 1990s, I was looking at these behaviors for other reasons, and I started to become intrigued by them because they were so prominent and so interesting and so different from the movements that these animals made when they were awake. And so it seemed as if there were two classes of movements in early development. One are it could be for a rat or human, it could be suckling and moving the limbs and reaching for things, or moving their limbs as if they are reaching for things. But and then later on crawling, walking, things like that, all the way, talking eventually. Those are the wake movements. But the twitches were some completely different. They don't cause locomotion. They don't accomplish any obvious motor goal. They're just these popcorny sorts of movements of the limbs. And then you start to look at how often they're happening. And, we eventually, tried to estimate it. It's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of twitches every single day in a baby rat. And then you say, okay, wait. So the dominant view is that twitches are a byproduct of dreams, but they're happening the most in babies. And you have to ask yourself then, well, what the hell are babies dreaming about? You know, I mean, what experiences are they having that requires them to dream? And you can make up stuff if you want to, but it just doesn't make a lot of sense, on its face. And then we eventually started to do experiments on it. So we would, if dreaming is supposed to happen in the cerebral cortex, well, what happens if you prevent the cortex from communicating with the brainstem? Doesn't affect twitching at all. You remove the cortex from the entire equation, and the twitching doesn't change at all. So the twitching is being produced by the brainstem. And then over time, we had to develop methods to record brain activity in infant rats because the ability to do that was very, very limited. And we couldn't do this work in humans because you can't record the brain activity you need to record. And then we started to map out the amount of brain activity that was associated with it. So there are parts of the brain that produce the twitches, and then there are all the parts of the brain that are receiving information about the twitches. So every time you twitch a limb, your muscle stretches, and you have what are called muscle spindles, which detect the amount of stretch. And that's one of your major proprioceptive, sensors. And that provides all of this feedback up that passes up into the brain. And then you see that when a particular limb twitches, a particular part of the brain is being activated because these systems are connected in very functionally precise ways. And then you start to see how much activity is coming out of this process. And then when we recorded wake activity, so the animal's twitching, and we're seeing all sorts of brain activity popping all over the place when, we're sticking these final electrodes in and detecting all this, all this information. Then the animal wakes up and its limbs are going crazy, and we see almost nothing. So in early development, the system seems to be tuned to the twitches and tuned out from the wake movements. That gives you an additional idea that there might be something special about twitches. Well, what would that be? And so the thing that makes twitches so distinctive is not only that they happen hundreds and hundreds of thousands of times per day, but every single movement is very discrete. Do you remember, if any of your listeners watched The Hunt for Red October, they may remember the movie, with Sean Connery. And there's a time when, it actually happens in every submarine movie, when they want to like detect something outside the submarine. So everybody has to get super quiet inside the submarine. And then they send out a ping, to the outside world, and they get a very distinct signal back about what's out there, right?
Yeah.
So everybody goes quiet, and then you go like, in fact, Sean Connery says at one point, he says, "One ping only, please." And this was about communicating with another thing. But the point about sonar is the same, that if you want to have a very precise image, echo, you send out one ping, everything else is quiet, and you have a very high signal to noise ratio. But that's kind of what happens during sleep. You have the sleep paralysis, you shut down everything, and then you twitch one finger, okay? And then you get information about the relationship between what caused that twitch and the signal that comes back into the brain. It's discrete. It's a discrete signal. Your signal to noise ratio is extremely high in a situation like that, which is a very, very ideal circumstance for learning about connections, creating stronger connections about functionally related parts of your brain and body. And so that's what we think twitching is doing. There's much more to say about it because there are other dimensions to it, but that was one of the first ahas, for us that uh, that there was a lot more going on here than met the eye.
Mm-hmm. And it really like sounds like twitching is some sort of brain workout during the sleep. It's a
Yeah, there's a lot going on. I mean, sometimes you look at this activity and it's just such a flurry. So we usually associate sleep with, stillness and quiet,
yeah,
isolation,
yeah.
But it can be quite the opposite.
Mm-hmm. And so, for example, what do you think of, like, is, or have you observed new neural networks forming, new connections forming, or have you done this sort of temporal analysis over the time, if there are some sort of new connections forming because of twitching?
That is a really great question and one that's going to take more work to actually answer. It's a harder question to answer
Mm-hmm.
than than I wish it were.
Mm-hmm.
But we have are a bunch of inferences that we can draw about what's happening. We do see changes. For example, there's another dimension to all of this, which is a little bit harder to understand, but it can be reduced first to the very simple observation, which is
Sure.
if I asked you, why can't you tickle yourself? Right?
Yeah.
And it's obvious when you think about it. It's because you're doing it,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
you don't feel it. So what does that mean to know what you're doing? And it turns out there's a huge part of your brain is doing predictions about upcoming stimuli. And twitching is, I mean, tickling is just one way to sort of probe that system, but it turns out that it's extremely important. The process underlying it is extremely important for everything that we do. It's known by several different names. So one very, it's called predictive coding in some cases now. That's very famous. But there's also just the general notion of an internal model, which is that we build models about how our bodies move. So if you close your eyes and you move your limbs, you know exactly where your limbs are in space because you have developed predictive models about where your limbs are when you're sending motor commands to them. So you're not necessarily getting sensory feedback from those limbs when you close your eyes and you move your limbs, but you're actually sensing the where your limbs are because you have these models or expectations about where they're going to be. And the question we had was how does that model get built? Because early, some early 30 years ago, people were trying to figure out how could you build a model like that. And one thing they said, they weren't developmentalists, but they said, well, if you had discrete signals that you could send out and build your models through using these discrete signals, that would help. They didn't know about twitching, but we actually ended up looking at the development of twitching and the development of the system underlying internal models, and they went together so that the twitching was actually activating these what are called motor copies, these motor commands. So every time you have a motor signal, you don't only send the signal to the muscle, but you send it to other parts of the brain to say, hey, you're about to get a sensory input. This is your expectation signal. And so we tracked that process, and it turned out that twitching was important for it as well. So twitches are the discreteness of twitches turns out to be, from an engineering perspective, a really great way to build maps of your body and your brain, and also to build internal models or predictive models about how your sensory system is going to work. So those are two things that we've been studying, but going off into adulthood, there may be others as well that we're looking into.
It sounds like training a GPS, or brain GPS of your body, right?
Yes, and in fact, some colleagues have, in various ways, have used twitching in robots.
Uh-huh.
Um, way of building robots that are more adaptable and flexible. So if you can build a robot by just hard coding, how the robot's going to work, or to teach it about its body and say, here you have this limb and has this joint and blah blah blah, and you just all hard code it. Not very adaptive and not very flexible. But if you allow the animal to twitch its limbs, if you allow the robot to twitch its limbs, it learns about in a dynamic. The neural network is built in a dynamic way, and it turns out it's much more flexible to insult. So if you have a six-legged robot and it's walking, and you amputate one of those limbs, if it learned about its limbs through twitching, it's able to regain a functional gait much more quickly than if not. So it turns out that these principles are in fact engineering principles, and that's why they probably are used so widely across the animal kingdom.
Is twitching related to one of the stages of the sleep? Like, is it like more about REM sleep, or it could be more about non-REM sleep? Like, what's the data there?
Well, so the irony is that I've been studying twitching and REM sleep because that's what it's been
Uh-huh.
always associated with. So twitches are a REM sleep
Okay.
phenomenon.
Okay.
But we found that in human infants around 3 months of age, we discovered a few years ago that twitches also emerge in non-REM sleep. And we're furiously trying to figure out what that's about. And we have some ideas and we're working on it. But so we've only seen it in humans. We have not seen it in other animals. They undoubtedly occur, but we don't know very much about it. It's just that the vast majority of what we know about twitching is during REM sleep.
Yeah. And then do we stop afterwards? What about adults then, or teenagers in that sense, right? How far we go with the twitching and sort of learning, etc.
Yeah, so this is really an important area. So this is something that I'm trying to investigate much more intensively now. So animals do twitch into adulthood. One thing that goes on, for example, in humans is rapid eye movements, which you can think of as twitching of the extraocular muscles. So the eye muscles basically twitch during sleep. And that happens throughout life. And then you look at other animals and you say like, okay, well, rats, they use their whiskers the way we use our eyes. I mean, they use them as very sophisticated, mechanisms for feeling the external world and learning about it. And they can do object detection. They can tell a round from a square object using their whiskers. They're very, very sophisticated systems. And they twitch their whiskers throughout life. And then you look at raccoons and ferrets. They use their digits quite ably, right? They twitch their digits throughout life. I have videos of elephants twitching their trunk. And so then you start to piece it all together, and a picture starts to emerge that certain types of animals with certain types of sensors that are driven by muscles, right? So trunks, hundreds of thousands of muscles and very sensitive sensory input. Whiskers, very dedicated muscles for moving the whiskers. Eyes, of course. So when you have these sorts of what are called active sensors that are controlled by muscles, when you have those systems, you're more likely to see twitching in those particular things. And so we're trying to document that now, which I'm doing with some students in my lab, and we're trying to put together a comprehensive picture of these relationships.
Now the question is whether it's really a byproduct, or people might think that it's some sort of random process, right? But on the other hand, your data, your work suggests that it's really fundamental for newborns to learn and stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, it is coming up in some like there's some fly development papers where people looked at these sorts of movements. But again, that's not really closely tied to REM because there's no evidence that REM exists in flies. So so some of these, people have documented twitches in octopuses. So Sam Ryder and others have, I had lovely papers on these phasic movements during sleep in octopuses. So not only do they twitch their tentacles, so that you can see them moving and you can see the suckers moving as well. So there's a lot of that, but also they have chromatophores, which are what causes their color changes, and that's under muscular control. And you see credible, unregulated, it looks like, changes in coloration in octopuses and also in cuttlefish were, similar. And so that with chromatophores, and then you see this activity. So I should have said, like, we know a lot about these sorts of behaviors in other animals. There was an interesting paper on jumping spiders not too long ago, um, uh, looking at the movements that they make when they're young spiders and developing. Um, I mean, there's a whole host of an understanding of these movements in a variety of different animals. In terms of, I have a colleague at Penn named Matt Kaiser who's done some work looking at larval twitches. So he's done some work in that domain. Um, Colleague in Germany named Niels Rattenborg, who looked at what he called rapid iris movements in pigeons, which is really fascinating because the iris is a smooth muscle, and so smooth muscle doesn't twitch. If it did, we'd have a problem with our heart. But what's different about birds is that the control of the iris is actually under skeletal muscle control. And they show these changes in the iris that happen during REM sleep in pigeons, which they called REMs for rapid iris movements instead of REMs.
That's
And
interesting.
so there are a lot of nuggets of interesting things out there that are, I think, opening the door to a larger perspective on these behaviors.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, and I think another problem would be to sort of differentiate between, the usual learning, which is like when we are awake, we do stuff, repeat, etc., and sort of, the learning during, let's say, sleep, or especially when we are twitching, right? The brain is still learning, right? So
Yeah.
how would we differentiate these two phenomena?
It's a big question. So, undoubtedly, we're learning while we're awake. We're learning while we're sleeping, or developing while we're sleeping, but and awake. So, the relationship between development and learning could be that they could overlap, but they also have certain unique features as well. The the real challenge is, like, thinking about it as what is best learned while you're awake and what is best learned while you're asleep. And so this is where the engineering aspect of all this comes in, because there are certain types of things that you can learn while you're asleep that are unique. And I think one example would be what I've just already talked about, which is the nature of the movements themselves are so different. So if you if all you had was wake and you were developing, the amount of just this, if I'm moving my hands, I'm moving my neck, I'm moving, I'm moving everything, is my eyes are moving, my mouth is moving, I'm hearing sounds. It's a very noisy environment. They see differences in gene expression. Or if you look at gene expression across, development, you find that in sleep, the types of genes that are associated with neuroplasticity and regeneration and those sorts of things are, or I should just say neuroplasticity, are more highly expressed than they are during wake in adults, for example. So there are multiple layers of change that happen both across the day and the night, during sleep and during wake, but also across the lifespan. And that's, that's a whole other layer.
Yeah. Yeah, and let's sort of define the plasticity part here. I mean, do you see then also sort of change over time again? I know that I'm repeating the over time sort of component to it, but like, do you see that the uh, because of twitching, there was like some sort of behavior learned, and then that also sort of evolves or changes over time? Would it be sort of easy to pinpoint that?
Not easy.
No, no, not easy, right?
Not easy. Like I gave you the example of the internal models thing. That's our best example right now.
Uh-huh.
The hard part is, tracking the complex, the most finely detailed aspects of sensory motor maps, for example, and how they relate to twitching. That's the difficult part right now, is actually documenting this amount of twitching produces this amount of precision or change or whatever to the way we understand our body. That is a very, very tough question to try to answer. Um, We've been struggling to find ways to do it. Some of them are methodologically limited because of the ages that we're looking at and the methods that are available. So some methods take a long time for them to develop. So for example, with optogenetics, 1 or 2 weeks are needed after you inject a virus for you to have the ability to use the optogenetics to control a system. And 2 weeks in the life of a baby rat is the difference between birth to basically eye-opening and moving around. So you don't have the full range of tools that we need to answer some of these questions yet. We're still working on it.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that there could be like many follow-up questions, but let me just go and sort of let's get into one more detail, and then we can move on from the section. So the amount of sleep, does that matter? I mean, if the babies, they have typically the 16-hour sleep. If they have, if certain babies, if they sleep only for 10 hours, and
Yeah.
then what about the periodicity, like, because they do not sleep 16 hours in a row, right? It's like
Right.
a different time point. So does that matter, etc.?
The answer is it may matter, but it may not. So
Mhm.
one of the things that distinguishes infant sleep from adult sleep is that, as you alluded to, it's highly fragmented.
Yeah.
And also early development, it's not really closely tied to the light dark cycle, to the circadian cycle. So you have lots of small bouts of sleep and wake being accumulated across the day and the night. And then over time, we've documented this and we're doing this now in babies, but we've also documented this in baby rats. The bouts get longer and longer and longer, and then they start to move into more towards one part of the day or the night. So in rats, when they're born, it's highly fragmented and random. By the time they're 15 days of age, you're seeing longer bouts with a predominance towards the night, towards the daytime, because they're nocturnal animals. So they sleep more during the day than they do at night. And you see that. And in humans, it's the opposite direction. So we sleep more at night than we do during the day. And humans are a little bit odd in that we have 1 or 2 very long bouts of sleep across the night. Most animals are polyphasic, meaning that they are just having lots and lots of smaller bouts. Um, I have some colleagues in Europe, Paul-Antoine Librel and Niels Rattenborg. They were looking at chin strap penguins in Antarctica. They were looking at females who were nest guarding because they were protecting their young under high predatory pressure, and they engaged in short bouts of sleep that basically were, so they would go to sleep for a very short period of time. They would accumulate the same amount of sleep, but they would accumulate it in very, 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 very short bouts, and what they called microsleep. And so that suggests that you can get the benefits of sleep in small bouts. So you don't have to have long bouts, but it depends on the species and it depends on lots of things. And maybe it may just be making the best of a bad situation. So there may be costs to doing it that way, but the costs of having your young eaten by a predator are probably higher for your fitness. So that's the trade-off that animals often have to make with these things.
And what about humans? I mean, is there sort of recommended time slots, like in the sense, like, go for like a longer, or try and make sure that babies get like a longer sleep, etc.? Or
So that's a great question. So there are two. So there are 2 places where sleep medicine, I think, or sleep policy is having an impact. I have a colleague, Jeroen Dudink, in the Netherlands, and he is heeding this. He's a neonatologist, so he works in a neonatal intensive care unit in the hospital in Utrecht. And what he's doing is he's developing systems so that the incubator has on top of it basically looking down on the baby. They're doing machine learning of the baby's sleep. So they're detecting when the baby is asleep or not. And then it has basically a monitor that says to the doctors and nurses, the baby's asleep, leave the baby alone, or the baby's awake, you can go in and do what you have to do now, right? So old school NICUs were loud, lit, bright, just terrible environments for babies. If you think about coming out of the womb early, especially if you're a premature infant and you're coming into this incredibly disturbing environment, what would that do to a developing baby? So what's happened over time is that NICUs have become much more cognizant of the needs, especially the sleep needs of these infants. And so they're creating those sorts of environments that are better for them. But the one that's happening right now in the Netherlands is probably the most sophisticated in terms of actually trying to protect sleep from interruption. So that's one thing. There's another thing that happens in adolescence when, for example, in the United States, kids would have to wake up at like 6 o'clock for school to get there, super early. They're always sleep deprived. I mean, what were we doing to these children? And basically creating a learning environment that was just terrible because you set up schedules that did not obey or pay attention to the needs of the kids. And so Mary Carskadden, who was a very important sleep researcher with, just hugely influential, actually did work showing that these were detrimental, that these schedules are detrimental to these kids, especially during adolescence when their sleep needs are quite high. And so that ended up changing, policy in the United States, and I imagine elsewhere, when it comes to these sorts of schedules. So, those are two examples of where paying attention to the biology of us can lead to important policy changes with real world positive ramifications.
Yeah, I mean, let's go there. Let's talk about the learning and memory part, right? Because this is where a lot of sort of modern age either problems or solutions lie in a way. So you mentioned already about plasticity, right? Synaptic plasticity. So um, let's first talk about twitching part. So do you see that in certain babies twitching appearing to the same muscles again and again? Like, do you see that sort of repetition of the behavior?
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, that's
Yeah, I mean, we've documented we've documented how the twitching changes across limbs over time, within milliseconds of each other, and also over much longer time periods. And yes, the same limbs are twitching a lot. But again, the important thing is that they're discrete, so you don't see lots of simultaneous twitches. And which parts of the body are twitching changes across time. So, for example, in human infants, what we see is that at birth, there's a lot of twitching in the face. So you see lots of, if you looked at it, you would think that the baby was expressing its emotions. Okay, but we don't need to go there. It's not necessarily an emotional thing, but the face is a sensory motor system, a very complex one. And so you see lots of twitching throughout the face, and that's very high. The rates are very high. And then over the course of the next several months, the overall rates of twitching in the face go down, so that they almost go away. So that tells you that that face system, so think about twitching in a sense, is giving you insight into the timing of the development of that particular system. Okay. Contrast that with the fingers and the toes, which twitch from like the first to the 6 months, same level. It's just the same level of twitching, and I don't even know if it goes. We don't know when it goes down. So because we don't have good data on the changes across the lifespan and twitching in different parts of the body. We don't know anything about that. Again, the reason for that is that people are not, as long as you characterize twitches as being byproducts of dreams, who's going to spend the time to study a byproduct, right? So the only reason you would think to look at these things is that, oh yes, okay, it might actually have value to understand twitching for a variety of reasons, including giving you insight into the development and change in particular sensory motor systems over the course of the lifespan. So that I think has lots of possible positive ramifications for our understanding of these systems. So in the eyes, of course, the rapid eye movements, they continue throughout life as well. So things change. In rats, the tail twitches like crazy when they're born. By the time they're 20 days of age, the tail twitching has almost disappeared. So it's the same sort of story as with the face in humans. So that tells you something about how they use their tail and when it develops. So we're still piecing it all together.
Yeah. And is this true that newborns, even like before they start, interacting, doing much, they are kind of then learning a lot, basically, right? That means it's not really like I don't know whether we can go into this sort of conscious subconscious kind of terminology, but the point being that they are learning a lot even when they are sort of not interacting as much in the early years, right?
Yeah, so let me add a dimension to this conversation on that front. So what are they learning? Like,
Mm-hmm.
so we normally think about it, okay, well, we have two arms, we have two legs, we have other parts of our body that move.
Yeah.
What's going on there? Because what's the big deal? You just genetically encode it, blah, 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 the usual sorts of things.
Yeah.
By the way, nonsense. Happy to talk about that.
Yeah.
There is no hard wiring, and I can prove it to you, I think,
Mm-hmm.
by pointing out that when people are born, it's true for dogs too, it's true for other animals, true for humans.
Mm-hmm.
When people are born without arms, a condition known as amelia,
Mm-hmm.
when you're born without arms, you learn how to use your feet and toes the way we use our hands and our fingers. And so there are videos online, you can see them there's a guy that I have a video that I use in my talks all the time. This guy, he has no arms. He's able to pick up a cigarette with one foot, and he's able to take a Bic lighter in the other, flick with his toe, the Bic lighter. He's smoking with his foot, and he lit his cigarette with his toe. I challenge anybody who was not born without arms to be able to learn how to do that. You cannot. If you want to know the difference between developmental plasticity and learning, that tells you the difference. There's a period of time when either you learn how to use a system a particular way or you don't. And the thing is that the way that gentleman learned how to use his feet, the way we use our fingers, that is the way we learn how to use our fingers. It's the same process. I don't think it's a coincidence that the toes twitch as much as the fingers in early development. So there is inherent plasticity in us, to be able to use parts of our body in ways that either we do it a certain way or we lose it. And once we lose it, once that time passes, you're not, maybe someday we will, but you're not going to be able to figure out how to do that again. No human being that I've ever seen has been able to learn how to flick a Bic with their toes. If they didn't do it, throughout, learn how to use their feet that way when they were young. So that's a key insight to me because you see it all over the place. So I have another video of a dog running on a beach, and the dog is just running beautifully down the beach. And then he turns a corner, and you see that in his body that he has two forepaws, but he has no hind legs because he had amelia that basically prevented him from growing. So he's running, you can't tell. You're looking at it from the front, you can't see whether his hind legs would be, and he's running beautifully down the, Or in the movie called Freaks, which came out in 1932, a guy by the name of Johnny Eck, who was born without legs, he was a hand walker, and people who are born without legs become hand walkers. And he also just could use his hands the way we use our limbs, our legs. And so that is developmental plasticity in action. But the point is not that these folks were special. They were special in the sense that their body is not typically formed, but they're not special in terms of how they develop. We all develop the same exact way. So what that means is that each of us has to learn how to use the body that we have, not necessarily the body that we were supposed to have.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
So that process is universal. That process is individual. And twitching and sleep, I think, are essential for the ability to do that. And so, all the details need to be worked out. But to me, that's the fundamental thing about development that has to be explained, and is still, a beautiful mystery for us to try to figure out.
Yeah. I think the whole debate of nature nurture, it just sort of came out from the revolutions in genetic engineering and stuff, and I think it just, I don't know, like I think it feels pointless after a point, because uh, I've done few conversations on the topic, and kind of know the sort of sides from both factions in a way. But a lot of studies now emerging where they clearly show the impact of environment in the development and growth, and as you mentioned, that there is this inherent plasticity to the life. So that we can't deny it, and you have also given beautiful examples, I think, to sort of support that.
Yeah, no, I think it's, I mean, certainly the debate is as old as time itself, it seems, but um, it definitely got supercharged through the
After the
genetic revolution.
Yeah, yeah,
And now because of what's happening, with respect to the use of genetic engineering, it's leading. There's no question that the genetic tools are extraordinary for doing things, but that doesn't mean that genes are the driver or the sole fundamental process that we use for development. Development, as you noted, is way more general, broad than that.
yeah,
But the debate continues because people cannot get away from thinking about biology as a black and white process. They just, dichotomous thinking pervades so much of our lives, and it pervades scientific thinking as well. And it's very, 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 very frustrating as a scientist who studies development to hear people simplify things to just stupid lengths. Excuse me.
yeah,
So,
yeah. No, I
yeah.
mean, on this platform, we don't do that. We we are also interested in grace. So yeah, I discuss a lot about like the plasticity, and in general, like when we start describing life, how it is sort of a continuous process. Of course, the way we look at, I mean, that's something to our psychology rather than living systems in a way, where
Mhm.
we sort of look at things or we want to look at things in this black and white manner. But in reality, it's always this, that there are a lot of grays in between, and
Absolutely.
we just need to look at, or start looking at, these systems differently. And yeah, I
Yeah.
think this is where the understanding of science would help a lot, especially the new science which is emerging. And then, for example, now we are discussing about twitching. Who would think about twitching in this sort of profound learning way, where it can contribute a lot to a person's life. So yeah, that's quite interesting.
Yeah. It's refreshing to hear you say that. So
Yeah.
thank you.
I mean, as I said, like this is first time I'm discussing about it and kind of learning about it. I'm sure that everyone would agree that we have observed this, but what is the role of it? I mean, I think most of the time we would just sort of leave it at sort of a random motion, or kind of that sort of scenario. But yeah, I mean, since there is sort of emerging science on that, it's quite interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's go back to the learning and plasticity, as you mentioned. So you also mentioned about students sleeping less, and this is where the whole, I mean, we are in this sort of information age where we have a lot of stuff going on, a lot of stuff around us, right? And yes, we do have to spend a lot of time to learn, right? And in general, the notion is more you sort of spend time to learn, you would and of course, the time when you're asleep, you're just wasting it, right? uh, so let's kind of debunk that. Let's talk about that. Like, does it really help if we are sleeping less and kind of trying to read and learn more?
Well, so I do not study learning. I should be very, that's not
Hmm.
my area of focus.
Hmm.
But what I understand from, it does impact sort of some of the things that I do study developmentally. And what sleep affords is the certain types of events that happen in your brain are more likely to happen during sleep than they are to happen during wake. And some of those processes have been demonstrated to varying levels of convincingness to people in the field, but still the consensus view seems to be that sleep is important for various aspects of memory consolidation. So we don't want to think about sleep and wake as sort of two antagonistic things. They are complementary. So what you learn during the day, you learn so much stuff and you're going to remember a certain proportion of it and you're going to forget the rest. There are people who don't forget. There are famous people in the literature, who could not forget. There are people who are studied for that, for just having incredible memories. I don't know if they've been studied well from a sleep perspective yet, interestingly, but there is diversity, if you remembered everything, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between silly things that you've learned and important things that you've learned. And of course, if you forget everything, as you do, as what happens with certain types of brain damage, et cetera, your lives are extremely, the lives of such people are very, very anemic compared to, or dysfunctional, right? You just can't function without having those sorts of memory processes. So we need to have an ability to take what we're learning, what's important during the day, and consolidating it. And sleep is important for that. So there are particular types of rhythms that in the brain that happen during non-REM sleep, certain things that are happening during REM sleep, again, complementary in a complementary sort of a way. And if those things that are interfered with, you're going to have less memory. As we get older, our sleep becomes less efficient, and those processes that happen during sleep become less able to be expressed. And so is it a coincidence then that our memories get worse as we get older, or are there other processes as well? So I think that that's something we need to figure out. How much of what happens to us as we get older is due to losses of sleep, and how much of it is just due to other processes, more generic processes that affect memory and sleep simultaneously. So that's, I think, an important thing for us to figure out. But what we do know is that over the course of your lifespan, neurons that are involved in the production of sleep die. I mean, and there aren't a lot. In some parts of the brain, there are a few tens of thousands of neurons, So it sounds like a lot, but when you have an 86 billion neuron system like we do, and you lose 30,000 neurons in a particular part of the brain, that's all it takes to sort of turn you from a happy sleeper to an insomniac. And if you are an insomniac, you are going to almost certainly have serious problems with things like memory. So, this is where I think the field has to go from a medical standpoint in terms of understanding these things, because quality of life is just so massively affected by these fundamental processes.
I mean, also with the in terms of policy making, right? Like how much we want to push it. That also
Yes.
matters, right?
Yeah, but I mean, absolutely. And you can see that there's concern out there, because you can hardly pick up a newspaper these days without getting advice about sleep.
Yeah.
So a lot of people care about it. It affects you. Everybody knows you have a good night's sleep and you're cheery from the start, and you have a bad night's sleep and all you can say about is I slept badly last night, and everybody sort of cares about it. So yeah, and we lead stressful lives. So stress is not good for sleep.
Yeah.
So yeah, I although this is not where this is not something that I study, it is something I care about. It's just a person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me ask you like one last question, then we can wrap it. So what about sleep in neurodivergent children? I mean, especially if the children with autism or ADHD, for example. Do you study? Have you studied some of the children in like with twitching and stuff with in terms of neurodivergent cases? And what about in general your understanding how the sleep is affected in these cases?
Yeah. Okay. So by coincidence, at the end of this week, there's a workshop at NIH, the National Heart and Lung and Blood Institute, and I'm actually giving a talk on the animal side of things for that talk. So it's all about neurodevelopmental disorders and sleep.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a huge amount of interest in how kids, whether it's ADHD or autism spectrum disorder or developmental coordination disorder or schizophrenia,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of evidence linking neurodevelopmental disorders in general with sleep, with certain types of motor dysfunction, and of course cognitive processing. And so the role of sleep in this is very interesting. The problem is right now that we don't know if sleep is a cause or a consequence of those disorders. And that's not going to be easy to figure out.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a real challenge. And so it's also hugely important, as I will argue in my talk, that that we have to get the questions right, you know. So we have to have the ability to figure out what specific question are we trying to answer about sleep. And so our definitions of sleep and what we think are the functionally important developmental aspects of sleep are extremely important for addressing problems of what can go wrong in kids with neurodevelopmental disorders. Now, the field has been, this is a place where genetic insight can be a benefit, but it can also be a hindrance. Because if you focus too much on genes, you lose sight of the desire to understand the developmental process. And what is really, really troubling about the neurodevelopmental disorder field is that in general, neurodevelopmental disorders are not studied neurodevelopmentally. And so you end up with people studying kids who are children, adolescents, and adults, which could very well be long after the key developmental events have occurred that put kids on the path to these disorders. So you have to understand typical development. You have to understand how it happens normally. That's what I do primarily. And we just don't have a lot of people doing that kind of work compared to the people who study sleep in adults. So that's a big problem. And then when you start studying disorders, in the animal world, it's almost all genetic disorders, which is a very limiting perspective, I think. And you don't end up with people with enough of a developmentally sophisticated view of things studying these processes. And so we end up with a distortion field, and it's not good. Um, I'm trying to be very careful here because I mean, there's a very, this is both, this is a fraught topic for a variety of reasons because people want to have the tools to be able to understand it. And they see the genetic mutants as their foothold into understanding these processes. But there are severe limits to using that approach, I believe. And that is one reason why there has been very little progress in the field, is because the perspective they're taking is just too narrow. Now, that's not to say these are easy questions to answer. They are not. But I don't think we've been going about it the right way. And that's just my view of things. And that's science, I mean, I might be right, I might be wrong, but that's just the way I see it. And I've tried to do some work in this field with genetically altered animals, and I see lots of problems with it. But, that's been my experience.
Yeah. I mean, I've been thinking about this because I mean, I know some of my friends that they have done these genetic tests before their babies were born, and just to sort of understand this, a predisposition in or genetic predisposition which may be present in these babies, and I'm sort of I am looking at scientists, if there are scientists who can kind of, or who are looking at the potency of these tests, like how frequently this happens, that the or sort of the frequency which is reported is really valid when it comes to the children that they are born, and because there is a lot of plasticity in the development, and this is where like things gets difficult and interesting at the same point, like how reliable these tests are, and how far we can go with these tests in general, right? And especially because of the development part. Yeah.
Yeah, so you see this in a variety of ways, in a variety of different disorders. What happens is that people start off thinking we're going to find the gene. I mean, when I was in grad
Exactly.
school, everybody was looking for the gene,
Yeah.
and then it failed. You know, they're precious few single gene diseases or disorders in humans or any animal. So that's just rare. And so it was all failed, but they didn't question their general approach. What they did was they modified it and said, oh, now we're going to look for polygenic processes. So it must be a combination of things. But the progress on that front has also not been terribly impressive. So you can either continue down this road and your commitment to understanding the genetic basis for all of these various things, or you can take, say, like, maybe our perspective is not as fruitful as it should be, and maybe we should actually become more developmental process people and think about the developmental process that gives rise to these things. And there's so many reasons to believe that many of these disorders are going to have very complex developmental foundations. And if you don't understand the process, you're going to be blind to the things that actually matter. And so, again, this is a frustrating part of being a developmentalist, because I mean, I study typical development because I think you have to understand that as your foundation. But at least that's what I focus on. I should say that in our work that we're doing in the neonatal intensive care unit, the one reason why we're looking at premature infants is that they are at higher risk for a variety of different disorders. And so there's a chance that we'll be able to gain some insight into the role that sleep plays in early development that gives rise, because we'll be following these kids longitudinally for the first early part of their development. So there are a variety of different approaches to take here. None of them are perfect, but I'm pretty sure that the way we're doing it right now is not the right way.
Yeah. So are you suggesting that developmental delays might also affect the behavioral aspects in general?
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that we've learned a lot through the work of Barb Finley and her students um, is that the developmental events that happen, in humans and in all the other animals they've looked at, the developmental events happen in a very, very orderly fashion. So the timing can be changed. So, we live 80 years, a rat lives a couple years. So whether you have everything happening in a couple years or across 80 years, what changes very little is the ordering of developmental events. And they ordered, like they did hundreds of events, and they looked at how they occurred. And so there's a tremendous amount of conservation of that. So the question becomes, what happens if you alter the timing of development? So you invert the order of things. So what happens when things don't happen in their proper order? What happens when certain events don't happen? What happens to the other things that might have depended on that event happening? That's the kind of information we need to have if we're going to understand atypical development and the emergence of disorders. We need to understand the limits of those processes and how much of a change can you tolerate in your species. And so that's where we need to understand things so much more. We have the ability, we have certain hints of places to go in and create changes in the developmental process and see how they cascade to produce these other sorts of events. But we're not looking at things like that. We're just sort of like we're shutting down a gene that affects all kinds of things, and we're not getting the kind of insight that we need to really, really deeply understand these processes. That's a whole enterprise that's just not being tapped into right now, as far as I know. I really appreciate it. It was an enjoyable conversation. I really appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you.